And I went to my mother and I said, "Mom, why is the FBI here?" You know, and in my mind I thought maybe my father was a bank robber, because that's how I knew about the FBI. So they weren't even married when I was growing up, but they kept telling me they were married, and so there was a lot of need for therapy in the household.
Good morning, everybody. Today we are joined by Mr. Paul Pitcoff. Paul Pitcoff introduced me to the art of filmmaking. He was a professor at Adelphi who led me and 10 other students and 4 professors on a cross-country trip to make a documentary film. His mentorship ultimately led me into going into the world of film production so many years ago.
While you were writing your book, Cold War Secrets, were any of the discoveries you made, did any of those change the way you approached the writing of the book?
Well, one of the things that happened was I started the book. It was supposed to be a memoir about me, and partway through the book, I realized that my parents were a hell of a lot more interesting than I was. And so even though they had long passed away, I got mad at them for taking over my memoir. I don't think I'll ever forgive them for that. So that was the biggest revelation for me, was that they had such an interesting life, and I thought, you know, this was going to be so much more about me, and I got taken in by that. The other interesting thing, which I think other people experience this too, is they held a lot of secrets from me, and what pissed me off was I didn't find out about them until after they were gone, and looking it up basically on Google, doing all sorts of research. One thing in the book which gives you an idea is when I was a little kid, I was 4 years old, I said to my mother, "You know, Mom, I want a brother or sister." And she said to me, "Oh, we love you so much that we're never going to have another kid." So, you know, I was disappointed, and about a month later, my father puts me in the car, and we go out to a little airfield where a tiny little plane lands, and about 15 sailors come out of the plane. And my father points to one of the sailors, and he says, "That's your brother." And sure enough, I had a half-brother who was 15 years older than me. And I went to school, and I told all my friends that brothers come out of airplanes. So that was my life, was listening to listening to my parents lie to me, and and facing the consequences of that.
What years does the book cover?
It was really the McCarthy era. I mean, that's what I was embedded in, is the McCarthy era, and there was a lot of fear, particularly in the area of New York where I grew up. There were a lot of people who had been blacklisted, and many of my school friends, their families were lefties, or they were in the Communist Party. And so that was the era, and it was a frightening era. And it was also, when I went to school, we were taught that we could be bombed by the nuclear bomb. So the most absurd thing is, in school they would make us go under these wooden desks, and somehow that was going to protect us from the nuclear bomb. So we grew up with that kind of fear, and you know, it was. I think my parents had interesting friends. That was a wonderful thing for me, and I never knew any of the real stories, but people like this story is that I think my first interest in photography was they had a friend who was a photographer. And, I was a little kid and I didn't even know you could, be a photographer. And he was famous because he did a Life magazine spread of people in the roller coaster. He got up in the front of the roller coaster and with a 4x5 camera, he took pictures of people screaming and, and having fun and all that kind of stuff. And he was a wonderful guy for a little kid. And when I would go over and they would have adult parties, he would always turn to me and say, "Paul, what are you drinking tonight?" And I'm like 6 years old, 7 years old, and he would say, "Oh, the usual." And then he would pour Coca-Cola and chocolate syrup and milk, and that was my usual while they were drinking, cocktails and stuff. But then I found out, again, what was exciting about doing the film is when I researched him, I found out that he was an acrobat in the circus before he became a photographer. And so I was surrounded with these people who did all sorts of kind of interesting things, certainly that kids would find interesting. And I think that influenced my life. But, you don't know, doing the book was wonderful for me because I don't think I realized how much my background, even as crazy as it was so stimulating until I got older and started to make these connections.
What was it like when the FBI came to your house and you were 11 years old the first time?
Well, this was so this was so typical of my mother. Is the FBI knocks on the door, I go and answer it, and they say, "Is your father in?" And these two FBI agents, and in those days, my father was an electrician. I never saw many people in suits, so just the fact that they were wearing suits was really amazing. Nobody came to the house in suits. So I brought them in, and I found my father, and my father sat down and talked with them, and I was ushered out of the living room. And I went to my mother and I said, "Mom, why is the FBI here?" And in my mind I thought maybe my father was a bank robber, because that's how I knew about the FBI. And she just, very casually, she says to me, "Oh, they just happened to be in the neighborhood and they dropped by." And that was her response.
And you bought it.
And I bought it. I bought it until I was like 20. And the reality was that my father had done a little bit of spying for the Soviet Union. And so he knew how the Soviets ran spies. And he sort of became an expert for the FBI in explaining how the Soviets infiltrated our country with spies.
Was he a double agent? Paul, was he a double agent?
No, he was first. My father came from Odessa. He was a Russian immigrant, and he joined the Communist Party in the 20s, just when it was beginning in the United States, the American Communist Party, and he was all for that. In 1932, he was asked to leave the party because he all of a sudden became concerned that Stalin was having these bloodbaths in Russia.
Documentaries are usually a deep dive into a subject. Tell us a little bit about yours.
I did what were called institutional documentaries. They were for organizations that basically did service for other people. So it was always about people that were dedicating their lives to helping others. And I think what happened was, after a while, I wanted to be one of the people in my films rather than be the filmmaker. I started to feel like I was a professional voyeur rather than than doing anything. Because we met all these inspiring people in doing these documentaries. I remember one documentary we did was these people who had escaped from Vietnam, and they were explaining to me why they took the risk of taking their kids out of Vietnam. This was after we pulled out of Vietnam, and they were being re-educated, and the family lost a number of members in the family in escaping to the United States. And I remember the woman not lecturing me, but explaining to me that we in the United States didn't understand what it meant to have free speech. I started getting very interested in the First Amendment. I was teaching, basically I was teaching filmmaking, and I was running the Department of Communications. And the First Amendment seemed critical to understanding mass communications, and I became infatuated with it. And at the same time, there was a law school that just opened up, CUNY, at CUNY, which was an alternative law school. It was for lawyers that wanted to do public service. And they also, because it was an unusual school, they took a lot of older people who had, this would be a second career. So I thought, wow, I fit into that, and I had a sabbatical coming, and I thought that would be fun. So I took the LSAT, and I assumed I'd fail, and so then I wouldn't have to make any decision. But fortunately, I passed, and they accepted, and then I met all these people that were dedicated to going into public service, and when I was at law school, I had no idea that I wanted to be a lawyer. I don't think I really did want to be a lawyer, but I did an internship with an organization that was defending kids in foster care. And I really liked it. I liked working with the kids. The kids were fantastic. And one of the lawyers agreed with me, and she was much younger, and she was a really good lawyer. I was just, I had no experience as a lawyer. And so basically, she and I quit, and we started this organization where we were going to teach kids in foster care how to advocate for themselves, so they wouldn't rely on a lawyer. And the kids were fantastic. I mean, there was nothing. I just enjoyed being with these kids. These kids were so resilient and funny and inventive, and I'll tell you, I don't know if you have time for this, but I'll tell you one really interesting story about these kids. Is I'm teaching them how to advocate, and we're running a small organization. We eventually took our program across the country, but this was still before we did that. And we took all the kids in one of the groups. There was about 10 kids, and we took them to the J.P. Morgan Bank, which is a very fancy bank, and it was really impressive. And when we got to the vice president was going to address the kids and talk to them about how he had made it out of the projects and everything. It was a very moving occasion, and there was this. We met in this boardroom, that was for kings and presidents of, the world and everything. And, it was like on the 60th floor. It was just magnificent. So this one kid who was in my class, he says to me, Paul, he says, we have to have our graduation here instead of your shitty office. And we had just a tiny little office. And I said, I don't think they're going to give us, have a graduation for us. He says, come on, Paul, just ask them. They'll do it. And they need it. They need to see kids like us in this bank. And I kept saying, this isn't appropriate. Don't ask them. They're making a big thing for us. So then we have questions and answers, and this kid says to the vice president, he says the same thing. He says, I got a question. He says, you have this wonderful boardroom, doesn't seem to be used at all. He says, why don't you do the graduation for us? And sure enough, the vice president says, ah, that's interesting, but I don't know whether we can do it. And then the kid says to him, this is the kid, not me. He says, it'll be really good for you because we'll get the Commissioner of Child Welfare to come and you'll get a lot of good publicity and all of that. And so the vice president says, well, that sounds good, we'll do it. So then when we're leaving, I said to the kid, I said, how are we going to get the Commissioner of Child Welfare to come? He says, oh, Paul, it's simple. You tell him that J.P. Morgan's doing this, and he's going to want to be there. And of course, it all worked out. It was an incredible graduation. And it was all because this kid spoke up, and I kept telling him, be quiet. We're going to do the graduation.
Well, you've done so much as an advocator, as a documentary filmmaker, as an educator. How do you balance all of that in your personal life?
Well, I had a really good therapist. So so that was really helpful. I mean, that's a good question, I don't want to belabor it, but I think the thing that carried me through. I mean, this is going to sound funny. It wasn't until about 5 years ago or 6 years ago that I realized I was an educator. Like throughout my life, I never knew what I was. I always thought when I grew up, I would know what I wanted to be, and I never quite could firm that up. And then when I realized that I was an educator, I realized how much I love being with students. As you know, anybody that teaches is constantly learning and being exposed to new ideas, and it's never the same. The kookiness is really what gets me through. I mean, I've had students. Pete, tells this story, but it's a repetitive story. As I always had students that were saying to me they wanted to do this or that, and I always said to them, no, you can't do it, because I was the expert, and they always proved me wrong. I hated bureaucracy. I hated, one of the reasons I didn't stay as a lawyer for very long is I don't do well in bureaucracies and stuff. But when you're with students of any kind, it's just wonderful.
Was your mother a therapist?
My mother was a social worker and she a professor of social work, but she did do some. But as a mother, she went. I always tell people she went to every therapist in New York City because she was always having a state or something. She'd go to a therapist for a year and then say, "Oh, he's not working really well. I'm going to go try another one." So that was something that we talked about, and she had a lot of anxiety, and I think part of the anxiety was, which I didn't realize, was that I think she was always worried that her husband, my father, was going to be bumped off by the communists. So when he would come home, if he was late, she was always worried, and she called the police. The poor guy, she was always calling the police. When I was 14, the three of us took a trip across the country. We drove across the country in my father's jalopy. And my parents were unusually happy. And so, of course, I was happy and everything. And I didn't learn until, I don't know, maybe 10 years after my mother died and my father had already passed away, that trip was their honeymoon. They got married when I was 14. So they weren't even married when I was growing up, but they kept telling me they were married, and so there was a lot of need for therapy in that household.
Have you and your half-brother reconnected over the years?
When I graduated college, I wanted to be a still photographer, and I went to some high up person in the field, and I showed them my portfolio, and the person looked at the portfolio and said, "Kid, this is shit." you'll never make it as a still photographer. And he said, why don't you go into film? Is there a lot more jobs in film? And I remember I went to NBC and they interviewed me, and you know, at this point I wanted to be a cameraman or something like that. I'm right out of school and I'm, you know, got a college degree. And they said, and now, you know, this is 1965, so things were very different politically then. So the guy says to me, well, we have two entry-level jobs. You could be a page on the Jack Parr show. So I thought, well, hey, that's great. Jack Parr. I mean, I knew who Jack Parr was. I had no idea what a page was. So I said, well, what does a page do? I thought a page, maybe, you know, they run the cameras or something like that. He says, oh, the page, you know, takes people into the audience and sits them down. I said, you mean an usher? And he says, well, before we get any further, he says, you don't look like you could be a page. I had long hair, and you know, so we're not going to give you the job because of the way you look. And then I went to ABC, and ABC said, oh, we're going to put you in film services. Well, now I'm really rising to the top. Film services. I mean, it had the name film in it, you know. And God, was that an awful job? Because I took that job because they said film. And my job was when the advertisements came, the 35 millimeter ads for the Sunday night movie came. My job was to take the box with the 35 millimeter film and walk it to the editor and tell the editor where to put it into the film. That was my job, and it was a really boring job. And one day I couldn't find the right commercials, so it was for Mercury cars, and so I found an old Mercury commercial. I figured, what difference does it make? You know, one Mercury after another Mercury, right? And so they show it on national television, right? And the next day, Monday, I come in and the boss is screaming and yelling at me and everything like that. And I thought he was going to have a heart attack. And he says, you know, you cost the network $65,000, you know. And I said, you know, and I'm making $90 a week. And I'm thinking, how the hell am I going to pay that back? And the new Mercury cars were out, but it was the year before, you know, it was the old Mercury car. So I knew I was fired, and I didn't know how I was going to pay $65,000. And he's screaming and yelling, and he says, I want you to go back to your desk and write a memo really quickly and blame it all on the Hollywood office if they gave you the wrong number. And I said, I can't do that. I don't want to get, you know, somebody in Hollywood. You do it, or, you know, I'm going to call the police and everything. So I go back to my office and I call the woman in Hollywood and I said, you know, I have to write this memo and I got to blame it on you and I'm really sorry. I don't know what to do. And she calms me down. She says, every time we make a mistake, we blame it on you.
Thank you.
And I thank you, Paul, seriously, I thank you for motivating me, pushing me, teaching me, mentoring me, seriously, because I never would have gone into the business if it wasn't for you. I was going to go and be a lawyer. Not. But you showed me that filmmaking is a way of communicating that I didn't know before. And I really appreciate that. And 55 years later, I'm still doing it. Well, that's because of you motivated me and pushed me and always tested me. We had a lot of fun doing it. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, guys.
We're proud to be sponsored by Litchfield Distillery. They like to call themselves Batchers in honor of the early farmers of Northwest Connecticut, a region known for its ample yield of wheat, corn, and barley. Growing these crops in the rocky terrain requires grit and determination. For the past decade, Litchfield Distillery has been busy distilling Litchfield County's best harvest into fine craft spirits, one batch at a time. Litchfield Distillery, the spirit of hard work.